Okay, so in this last video, we drew a full motor unit, which is a motor neuron and the muscle fibers it controls. Now what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on the neuromuscular junction of that motor unit. So that's specifically where the neuron attaches to a muscle. Now you can see I picked one of the 4 neuromuscular junctions. I put a little red box around it, and then I just wrote zoom in on a neuromuscular junction. So we're going to zoom in right on this little piece here. We have the distal tip of an axon, and we have the muscle fiber or single skeletal muscle cell it connects to. So when I draw this, we're going to start by drawing the axon portion, so this little bulb, and it does look like a little bulbous structure, so I'm going to leave a little space, go down a bit, and draw that. Okay. So this is that distal tip of the axon. I'm going to label this letter B because up above we labeled our motor neuron B, so we'll just keep it nice and consistent between the 2 diagrams. So we'll branch that off there. Now, this connects right to the muscle fiber, and so if you remember, we have a sarcolemma, which is a cell membrane that surrounds this muscle fiber, so specifically it's going to connect to the sarcolemma. Now, it's not actually directly attached, the motor neuron, to a muscle cell. It actually just fits into the cell but doesn't really touch it. So it's like a little pocket where it fits into but doesn't actually touch it. So here's my sarcolemma. I'm going to dip down a little bit so it doesn't touch and continue across. And, oops, we'll label this the sarcolemma, or the cell membrane, specifically for a skeletal muscle fiber, a skeletal muscle cell. Now, if you notice right here where we have this little dip, it is still cell membrane, but it's been modified a little bit, so it's specialized to have a relationship with the motor neuron right here. So what I'm going to do is label this little dip with the letter D. And I'm going to flip my paper over because I don't think I'll have enough space and write what letter D is. So letter D, oops, really zoomed in, is called the motor end plate. And what that is just specialized sarcolemma, again, or specialized cell membrane, where the neurons attach. Okay, so motor end plate is specialized sarcolemma where motor neurons attach at a neuromuscular junction. So we'll flip our paper back over and we'll keep going from there. Next, if you notice, there's also this gap right here between the axon and the sarcolemma. So we're going to label this gap as well, and we'll label this with the letter F. And then I'll flip my paper over one more time, and we'll talk about what F is. So even though it's just a gap, it does get its own name, and that is called the synaptic cleft. And the synaptic cleft is the space between the neuron and muscle at a neuromuscular junction. Okay, so the space between a neuron and muscle at a neuromuscular junction, and that space is called the synaptic cleft. Oops, move that down a little bit. So now the neuron is like a lot of other cells in your body, and it makes proteins that it can use. However, once it's done making its proteins, it actually stores the proteins in these little packages called vesicles. And so I'm going to draw a couple vesicles, nice and big here. So it's like a little envelope or a little box that you store proteins in. And if you remember from biology, proteins can be hormones or act as hormones, and so it has little chemicals in it called neurotransmitters. So I'm going to draw little dots in there. And these are the neurotransmitters inside of the vesicle. So the neuron made those neurotransmitters, stored them in those little envelopes called the vesicles. And so what I'm going to do is label that with the letter E. Oops. And on the back, sorry, that letter E is really bad. On the back, we'll go ahead and write what letter E is. This is the last time we have to flip it over, hopefully. So the synaptic vesicle holds neurotransmitter, which is something that sends chemical messages. So it's very specific and has a certain message that it will deliver. And so specifically here, the neurotransmitter that is stored in the vesicles at a synaptic or at an axon's end at a neuromuscular junction is called acetylcholine. So that is the specific type of neurotransmitters. We have tons of different types in our bodies that is found here in the end of the axon in these little synaptic vesicles, acetylcholine. All right, so I'll flip back over. So we are right here. So the neuron makes these neurotransmitters and it saves them until your brain tells it to do something with it. So this neuron eventually attached to your brain at some point, and every time your brain says blink, then it sends that message down the neuron to the ends of the neurons. And then it'll send it right here where you have all these neurotransmitters. And what happens to the cell is that the cell will release. So it's going to like open up one of these synaptic vesicles, or all of them, into the synaptic cleft. And it's going to release all that neurotransmitter. And they're going to be all outside of the neuron. And then those neurotransmitters from the neuron are going to transmit the message to the cell to move. There's a lot of little steps that go on here, and we'll talk more about these tomorrow. But basically, the neurotransmitter releases a signal telling the muscle to do work. So there's actually a lot of different neurotransmitters in our bodies, some that will make you move your muscles. Some neurotransmitters will make you feel certain ways. For example, when you feel an adrenaline rush, or when you feel really excited, when you feel sad. It all has to do with different neurotransmitters that are sending signals to different parts of your body. For example, if you've seen those depression advertisements, depression is a severe disorder, and some people, what happens is their neurotransmitters, they don't have enough of them. And if you don't have enough, you can't have that sensation of happiness or excited. And then it's pretty crazy, but that's why some people have to take drugs, so that they can have those neurotransmitters and feel those certain ways, because their body's not making enough of them. Okay, but these neurotransmitters are a little bit different because they're going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft. When they reach the motor end plate, they'll trigger the muscle cell to do work. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish the drawing the muscle cell. And so what I want to show you is, again, this muscle cell is made up of myofibrils. So what are the myofibrils made up of? Well, actin. And so we're going to draw some actin and myosin to show what's going on inside, because right now we just have the cell membrane. So I'm going to go down here a little bit, and I'm going to draw my actin filaments, which are pretty hard to draw. And then I'm going to do another set over here. Oops. And so right now I'm drawing my Z lines. Okay. And now I'm going to continue with my actin filaments right here. So these are my thin filaments, or my actin filaments. And they're really, really not perfect. Sorry, they're like slanted. Oops, there we go. This one's a little bit better. And after I have all my actin filaments, I can go back in. Maybe I'll just use some red pen here and draw my thick filament, which is myosin. in an ideal world, these would be perfectly drawn straight across. So I apologize for that. And so this entire piece here, this is the sarcolemma, the cell membrane. This is the myofibril. So these are little filaments inside. So myofibril. So now we're really zoomed in on a muscle fiber because we're like inside looking at the little filaments that make it up. So that's our myofibril, made of, again, actin and myosin. All right, so next we're going to draw the sarcolemma along the bottom again. And I'll label that sarcolemma again as well. Oops. Okay, so this is the sarcolemma. Now you want to think of this, it's kind of hard to picture what we're looking at, but so a muscle cell has a cylindrical shape like this, right? Or a tube shape, okay? And so this is the muscle cell, and it has to be covered with the cell membrane. So here's our little cell membrane, like our sarcolemma. And okay, so this is our sarcolemma, and what we want to think of is it's wrapped all the way around our cell. And so what we did is we did a little cross section. So we just cut it like this. Oops, sorry, cut it right down the middle like this lengthwise. So what you're seeing is some sarcolemma in the front, some sarcolemma on the bottom, and you're seeing the myofibrils in between. So again, we kind of did like a vertical cut right down the top, and you're seeing sarcolemma on the top, sarcolemma on the bottom, and the myofibril in between. So we sliced it in half, and so that's the view we're looking at right now. And so in our sarcolemma, we don't want to forget we're going to have some nuclei. And you're usually going to find a ton of nuclei right near a motor end plate. And so we'll label that a nucleus. And then you'll also find those little mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. So we'll add those on in too. So a little squiggle line to show that's the powerhouse of the mitochondria of the cell. Maybe I'll label one of those. Right. And then the last thing I want to talk about is like large movements versus small movements. So let's move this up first so you can see this. Make sure you get everything in there. So if you look, this guy up here, this motor neuron is attached to 4 different muscle fibers. So every time your brain sends a signal down to the motor neuron, it signals all of the fibers that it's attached to contract at the same time. Okay, so you can't just kind of be like a motor neuron. I only want to lift half of this pen up. You either fully trigger it or not at all. So it's an all or nothing response. So for example, in your back, you have a huge muscle in your back, and that's actually just one neuron with hundreds of branches connected to it. And so that one giant muscle, your trapezius, moves at the same time whenever your brain signals that neuron to contract your entire trapezius. So if you tried to move a pen or write with your back, you can't do that. It's one giant movement, but your fingers or your eyes, for example, they have motor neurons with only 5 to 10 muscle fibers, so a lot less and in different places, and so you can have more precise movements. So we're going to write that down. We'll flip to the back side again and just kind of write a couple extra little notes here. So I'll say notes. So the first one we want to write down is that, we'll say each muscle fiber only has one motor plate, or in other words, each muscle fiber only has one motor neuron attaching to it. Okay, so each muscle fiber only has one motor plate or one motor neuron attaching to it. On the other hand, each motor neuron, because it has all of those axon extensions or axon branches, has many muscle fibers attached to it. Okay, and then two other things we want to know is that the less muscle fibers attached to a muscle, the more precise movements. So that would be in places like your eyes. You can move them so precisely and follow people as they're moving through the room. Your fingers. These are things that have very precise movements, and so we could say that they have less muscle fibers attached to a muscle. On the other hand, large movements, so when we have more muscle fibers attached to a muscle, like in our backs, we have less precise movements, or we could say more muscle fibers result in we have larger movements produced. So that's something to note too. So our little drawing, if we go back to the front, again, you can see that each motor neuron has many muscle fibers attached to it, and each muscle fiber only has one motor end plate or one axon attached to it, one motor neuron attached to it. And this guy right here, this muscle with all of its muscle fibers only has 4 little motor end plates, and so you could expect that this is probably a pretty precise movement. Like 5 to 10 is usually pretty precise. Now hundreds, like in our back, those are less precise and larger movements there. All right, so I'm going to zoom out if you need to get anything else on here. And we'll continue and practicing with this tomorrow.